Hi, this is Steve Batiuk of the University of Toronto.
And I'm Lucas Livingston, the creator and host of the Ancient Art Podcast and a board member of the Chicago Brewseum.
Lucas and I are finally bringing you another episode in our series Uncorked by Archaeology Now. In this episode, we're looking at drinking along the Silk Road, examining the history of alcohol from Central and East Asia. Now, as we've emphasized before, the discovery of fermentation and alcohol was not the product of a singular genius, but rather was something that was discovered over and over again around the world, all at different times. And it's not too surprising that Asia is another one of these hotbeds of alcoholic innovation. Also, if you remember back to one of the first episodes, one of the most important elements that's necessary for the widespread production of alcohol was pottery, which really didn't emerge in the Near East until about 6500 BC. Although our earliest evidence of wine comes from the Neolithic period and dated to about 6000 BC, we have seen tantalizing hints of earlier evidence of other alcoholic beverages, perhaps going back as far as the Paleolithic period. Asia, on the other hand, had developed pottery significantly earlier, dated somewhere between 16,000 and 13,000 BC, which means Asia had all the tools necessary for fermentation quite early on. All they needed was the medium and the know-how. However, our earliest hard evidence of an alcoholic brew in China comes from the Neolithic site of Jiahu, near the city of Zhengzhou in Henan province of China, and it's dated to about 7000 BC. While wild grapes grew naturally in the region, they are not the Eurasian grapevine, and therefore probably not great for making wine. What we can say for sure is that wine, as we know it from the Caucasus some 1,000 years later, or even beer, like we know from Mesopotamia and Egypt, were unknown in China for quite a while still. That being said, the earliest alcohol found is quite a special brew. Residue found in vessels from the Neolithic site of Jiahu, which were investigated by Pat McGovern and his team, produced evidence of tartaric acid, that telltale marker for grapes, but also, as it turns out, for hawthorn berries, the wild seeds of which both had been found in the excavations. Also found in the vessel was beeswax, suggesting honey, or more specifically mead, was a part of this concoction, along with some other beer-like substance made from rice or sorghum, which was probably made by masticating or chewing on the grains to start the fermentation process, much like what we saw with alcohol production in the Andes. This potent cocktail was clearly not an accident, but probably not created with a full understanding of the entire process. It really isn't until about the 2nd century BC when the Eurasian grapevine, Vitis vinifera, is introduced into the region by means of the Silk Road. And wine, as we now know it, starts to be produced in China. The area between China and the Near East, Central Asia, is often overlooked, but evidence is mounting that it may have played an important role in the story of wine. A recent study done by DNA specialists at the University of Copenhagen, who are examining the evolution of the Eurasian grapevine, have found evidence that sometime in the 5th millennium, so some 1,000 years after the domestication of grapes in Caucasia, it intermixes with a new species of grapes that appears to have some ties to the East. The importance of this crossbreeding is that the new genetic material greatly increases the size of the berries of Vitis vinifera, and thereby increases the amount of wine that can be made from these grapes. The result is a wine that can be made in volumes that it might finally become a traded commodity, as hinted at a little later in early Mesopotamia, with wine being one of the items being traded in the Uruk period. The question, of course, is what do we know about these early cultures in Central Asia and wine and their relationship to wine? The answer is unfortunately nowhere near as much as we would like to. In the Neolithic, as the early farmers of the Caucasus are developing agriculture and viniculture, in Central Asia, we have a culture known as the Jeytun, which runs from about 7200 to 4500 BC. In many respects, the Jeytun were more sophisticated than their Caucasian neighbors, with larger, more sophisticated architecture and better-made pottery. They grew wheat, barley, raised sheep and goat, all of which are actually not local to the region and were probably introduced from Neolithic societies in Iran. We presently don't have evidence of winemaking with the Jeytun, but wild grapes do grow in the region, and are found in the later Chalcolithic Anu culture sites of the region, which could be a prime candidate as the new genetic material introduced into Caucasia in the 5th millennium. Greater investigation into the ancient flora is needed to fully answer these questions. It's not until the middle of the 3rd millennium, with the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, another one of these poorly known early advanced civilizations, dated to about 2600 BC, that we really have real evidence of grapes. This civilization had large semi-urban centers, advanced metallurgy and stone carving, as well as ceramics. And looking at the material culture, we can see a distinctive drinking kit has emerged and is quite common, actually. This allows us to hypothesize that wine was probably being produced and drunk by these people. Not surprising, as at the same time in the urban centers of the Near East, of whom the BMAC actually had contact, wine is starting to be consumed more and more. But it's only when these regions are better explored that we'll have a better understanding of the role of wine of this important and poorly known society. Further east in modern Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, on the western side of the Pamir Mountains, we can find the Fergana Valley. We unfortunately know virtually nothing about its prehistoric occupation. We know that there is occupation in the Bronze Age, but it's so poorly explored that's about all we can presently say. But by the end of the 1st millennium BC, it's the center of one of the many Sogdian city-states that come to prominence in Central Asia. In the late 2nd century BC, a Chinese emissary, General Zhang Qian, reports on the verdant wealth of the valley and describes thousands of liters of wine in the stores of the palaces. One of the most celebrated regions of the ancient world for its grape cultivation and wine production, a Chinese encyclopedia from the Han or Tang dynasty notes, the western regions possess a grape wine which is not spoiled by the accumulation of years. A popular tradition among them states that it is drinkable for up to 10 years. But if you drink it then, you will be drunk for the fullness of a month, and then only be relieved of it.
Admiration for the Fergana Valley's wine came from both directions. The 1st century Roman historian Strabo praises the enormous production and superior quality of wine from this region, saying it'll keep for 3 generations and is so good you don't even have to add any resin to it. That doesn't say much for Roman wine. It's not until the Tang dynasty when we see a significant level of grape cultivation and wine production in China. I suppose you could say it's in the Tang dynasty when grape wine truly makes a splash. With the expansion of Tang China to the west in the 7th century, we see a sudden explosion of grapes and wine for the privileged. Grapes, raisin, and wine were sent as tribute to the Chinese imperial court in Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an. A frequently mentioned and peculiarly distinct type of Central Asian grape was known as the mare's teat, so called due to its oblong shape and the brownish-purple color. The grape itself was praised as a delicacy as much as the wine produced from it, to the extent that the emperor in Chang'an himself enjoyed these grapes in the grape gardens of his tabooed park. And the emperor Muzong in the early 9th century once said that a cup of this wine, when I drink this, I am instantly conscious of harmony suffusing my 4 limbs. It is the true princeling of grand tranquility. Evidence for wine and grapes is all over the high art of the Tang dynasty. We find a wealth of implements intended for drinking, like dainty lotus-shaped cups and serving ladles. And looking closely at their delicate repoussé and chasing decorations, we see clusters of grapes dangling from vines, a particularly favorite motif in Tang art. Art of the Tang dynasty is also renowned for its multicolored glazed ceramics, including incredible figurines from wealthy tombs. In addition to grapes and amazing wine, the Central Asian Fergana Valley was also the source of prestigious horses, which were frequently immortalized in Tang art, often accompanied by Central Asian merchants and groomsmen. One of my favorite details is on a pair of horses in Chicago. While most Tang ceramic horses usually have decorative plaques or floral medallions dangling from the harnesses, these two seem to have grape leaves and clusters of purple grapes. I wonder if the decision to combine these grape motifs with harnesses was totally made up for these sculptures, or if the artist was mimicking something they saw in real life. It's like the merchants are capitalizing on some free real estate to advertise the grape wine they have for sale. We already mentioned the Silk Road, this vast network of caravan routes connecting east and west. It spanned 2,000 years, from the 2nd century BC to the 18th century, stretching across thousands of miles from Chang'an to the Mediterranean. That name, Silk Road, though, is a bit of a misnomer. It was definitely not a single road, and silk was just one of many different commodities that were exchanged. I mean, we're neck deep here in wine and horses. Arguably, the most precious exchange happening across this network was not material goods, but ideas. Buddhism hitched a ride on these merchant caravans, along with different artistic and architectural developments. Silk Road's also a very modern term. Fun fact, Silk Road, or more accurately, the German Seidenstraße, was coined by the geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, who incidentally is overshadowed in history by his brash nephew Manfred, aka the Red Baron. One neat implement to travel the Silk Road along with wine was the raiton. We looked closely at the raiton vessel type in our Uncorked episode, Drinking with Dionysus, Alcohol in Ancient Greece. Just as the form of the animal-headed drinking mug made its way westward from the Near East to the Mediterranean, so too did it make its way to China and adopted indigenous animal and mythological forms like gazelles, phoenixes, and dragons. For all the popularity of Central Asian wine in Tang China, there was a cultural undercurrent of resentment for the aims taken to acquire it, especially among the soldiers stationed at remote western outposts. The Tang poet Li Qi, who lived from 690 to 751, captured the sentiment of these soldiers, composing, "Every year we bury our war dead in the sharp grasses, but all we guard are grapevines on their way to China." And there's no shortage of poetry about wine in China. The two often go hand in hand. In the artistic and intellectual community, intoxication often served as a lubricant for inspiration and creativity. During the Spring Purification Festival of 353, a group of scholarly friends gathered at the Orchid Pavilion for a day of poetry, music, and drinking. As they spread out along the banks of a river to compose poetry, servants sent cups of wine floating downstream on lotus blossoms. In a sort of drinking contest, when a cup ran ashore nearest you, you'd have to drink it and quickly compose a poem, or you'd be punished with even more wine. This early in history, the drink of the day might have been rice wine instead of grape wine, but the point remains. Actually, today, Shaoxing, where we find the Orchid Pavilion, is famous for its rice wine. Getting tipsy in historic China was also a means of political protest. Tales of the 7 sages of the bamboo grove from the 3rd century resonated among Chinese literati. These wizened intellectuals represented a turning point in social liberty. Stories and paintings of the 7 sages place them gathered in a bamboo grove discussing metaphysics, philosophy, playing music, writing poetry, and getting tipsy on wine. This form of recreation, namely excessive drinking, was a form of civil disobedience against the moderation urged by Confucianism and the social rigors that were demanded of the political station. Through intoxication, they were dismissed from their obligations of chaotic political life and intrigues. One of China's greatest poets was Li Bai, who lived from 701 to 762 in the Tang Dynasty. About 1,000 poems by him have survived. In addition to his fame as a poet, he was equally notorious as a drunkard. He was the most famous member of a scholarly group in Chang'an nicknamed the 8 Immortals of the Wine Cup. A member of the Chang Imperial Court once wrote of him, "I have as my guest probably the greatest poet that ever lived. I dare not recommend him to your majesty because of his one flaw. He drinks, often too much." And perhaps suiting a man who sought the meaning of life in a wine cup, Li Bai drowned drunk, face down in a river, trying to embrace the moon's reflection. He wrote a nice little poem that, in hindsight, seems almost a little prophetic of his fate. Among the flowers, a wine pot. I pour alone, friendless. So, raising my cup, I turn to the moon and face my shadow, making us three. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out our other episodes of Uncorked and more original video content from Archaeology Now. Be sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss out. See you next time.